Well, good evening and welcome to this National Social Sciences Week event. This particular event is a very exciting one and which asks us to reflect on the first 100 days of the Albanese government. And we have Anna Kagalia speaking on party dynamics of the Albanese government, particularly the relationship between the Labour Party and the Greens. We have Liz Hill speaking on women, wages and work. We have Lynn Chester speaking on energy and environment. Anna Boucher speaking on immigration, and Gabriele Abbondanza speaking on foreign affairs and defence. So we're covering critical public policy areas, a range of them, not foreign affairs, which brings us to our final speaker, Dr. Gabriele Abbondanza from the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Sydney, and Gabriele is going to speak on the Albanese government's approach to those two areas, defence and foreign affairs. So thank you, Gabriele.
Thank you very much, Rodney. Thank you everyone for being here. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this ancient land and would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Being one of my fields of expertise, Australian foreign and security policy, I would like to begin with stating the obvious. Australia is facing an increasingly volatile security landscape, and also one that is changing very rapidly, which is, of course, a phenomenon that wasn't happening to the same extent 20 or 30 years ago, for example. With specific reference to the new Labour government, it has inherited somewhat strained relations with some South Pacific and Southeast Asian countries. The same goes for select European countries and, of course, very strained relations with Beijing. So I think that what we can safely expect for the near future is a strong policy continuity when it comes to the key security posture of Australia, but also a much more inclusive and broader foreign policy. So we have had a very busy new government, as my colleagues have already emphasized, and foreign and security policy is not an exception. First of all, with the Prime Minister himself, Anthony Albanese has been extremely active just hours and days after he was sworn in. He flew to the Quad Summit. He had his first official bilateral meeting as a Prime Minister with President Joko Widodo of Indonesia. He then flew to Madrid for the NATO summit, which is quite a rare occurrence for an Australian Prime Minister. And all of this shows the priorities of the new government in Canberra. First and foremost, the traditional allies, but also a broader approach to the Indo-Pacific. But we've also had ministers that have been extremely active. Penny Wong, Foreign Minister Penny Wong herself, she has done multiple Pacific tours, the first of which was done to counteract a comparable Pacific tour by the Chinese foreign minister. And we've also had both the trade and the defense ministers that have been quite busy with smaller but still important Pacific tours. At the same time, the new government in Canberra has been quite active in trying to restore relations with Paris, which, as we all know, were quite strained before because of the AUKUS submarine saga, and to an extent restart relations, normal relations with China. And we have had, once again, both the defense and the trade ministers meeting face to face with their counterparts. We have also seen the new government being very active with reference to climate change mitigation, which, as we all know, is not merely a domestic policy issue. It's a planetary, it's a global policy issue. And with specific reference to what DFAT is concerned about, it's a regional issue, especially when it comes to South Pacific island nations and Southeast Asian nations. My colleagues have already mentioned some of the key new targets, a reduction of 43% of emissions by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. The new government has also been very active in trying to put more funds to allocate more funds for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which has been defunded for the best part of 20 years now. and also for Australia's foreign aid programs, which has been constantly defunded for the past 10 years. But the new government hasn't focused solely on diplomacy, on climate change, and on soft power. It has looked at so-called hard power too, and we can see that because of the announcement, the recent announcement of a new defense strategic review. This is an extremely significant document that will try to assess whether Australia is ready to tackle the security challenges that are unfolding for the 21st century in the Indo-Pacific. And if that is not the case, what can be done in order to approach a more benign condition? So we have a condition where Australia is already a big spender. Australia is the 12th largest military spender globally. And this may surprise some of you from the public. Australia is the 5th largest importer of arms globally. This is because Australia is undergoing a multi-domain modernization of its armed forces. And it tells us where we started. And of course, it doesn't say where we are going to go. And this brings me to some of the major challenges of the new Australian government for the next few years. First of all, it would be impossible not to mention the extremely difficult position of Canberra between Beijing and Washington. On the one hand, we have Beijing, which is our main trade partner and will remain so for the future, in the near future at least, despite our efforts to differentiate our trade partners. On the other, we have our security patron, the United States, which incidentally is not just Australia's security patron in the Indo-Pacific, it is also the security patron of other countries. Then we also need to address some specific security concerns. Since 2019, and increasingly so since 2019, Australia has been the object of cyber attacks almost on a daily basis on average. And Australia has also experienced the weaponization of its trade dependence on China. And then, of course, it would be impossible to move along without mentioning the risk of a potential conflict in or around Taiwan. The risks are very low, thankfully, but the risks of border skirmishes, for example, are not that low. And if that comes to happen, it would be reasonable to expect an engagement of some sort on the Australian part. Initially, this can be as a mere logistical support, but a commitment of some sort is to be expected. Then we need to understand, and this is a second major challenge for the Albanese government, we need to understand what to do with our capabilities, both present and future. And we need to understand that space is the new frontier, and Australia is already investing quite a lot, but Australia joined the space dominion very late compared to many other developed nations. And so this is a problem when it comes to interoperability with our major ally, the United States, for example. The cyber domain is also of critical importance. Australia copes much better there, but it is also a dominion where we can expect more challenges as the years go by. And then, of course, AUKUS. AUKUS revolves around increased interoperability, an exchange and a fostering of new research around cutting-edge technologies such as quantum computing, for example, and of course, nuclear-powered submarines as well. Now, in this specific respect, we don't know which type of submarines we will have, whether a Virginia class, an Astute class, a combination of both, where they will be produced, when we will have them, and of course, at what cost, entirely because we still don't know what kind of model, what kind of submarine we will have. We don't even know where and how we will service them. So these are all important questions that the Defense Strategic Review that I was mentioning before will have to answer by March of next year. And then we also need to understand what to do with our military expenditure, because like all middle powers, we have significant and strong economy, but we also have limited capabilities. So that means sometimes answering somewhat uncomfortable questions, such as, do we really need 450 the new infantry light vehicles at a cost that is approaching $30 billion? The answer is likely not. So we need to be able to spend where it actually matters. The last challenge that the new Albanese government will face, in my opinion at least, is that of having a more comprehensive, more inclusive foreign policy. What Australia has done in the past 20 years in terms of climate change mitigation, or lack thereof, in the past 2 years throughout the global pandemic, there is strong isolationism. And more in general, with sometimes paternalistic approaches, has been counterproductive. Equally, we need to understand that Southeast Asia, embodied by ASEAN, is going to become one of the main drivers of economic growth in the 21st century. And yet our commercial, scientific, and people-to-people links with Southeast Asia are still lamentably low. And last but not least, Europe. We have both the European Union and its largest members that have already started looking at the Indo-Pacific, but Australia, with the small exception of Germany and the somewhat shaky exception of France, doesn't really cooperate with any other country. And that is a problem because Europe has complementary means to those of Washington and Canberra, because it focuses on mutual economic prosperity and soft power rather than hard power. So these are my 2 cents in terms of what the government has done and what challenges lie ahead. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabriele. And that brings us to the end of our introductory speeches. There are already some questions in the Q&A.